The morning of May 11th, 1945. Southeast of Okinawa, aboard the Essex-class carrier USS Bunker Hill, Fire Controlman 2nd Class James Gallagher stands at his Mark 51 director station, scanning skies thick with low clouds and the promise of rain. His mount controls 4 quad Bofors, 16 barrels total, that ringed the carrier's superstructure in steel and aluminum. For 58 consecutive days, Bunker Hill's air group had pounded Japanese positions across 3,000 miles of Pacific Combat Zone, Iwo Jima, Tokyo, Kure Harbor, Okinawa. 58 days without respite, without rotation, without the luxury of doubt. At 10:03, radar operators in Combat Information Center strained against their scopes, fighting returns degraded by storm cells that obscured the morning sky. Then the call crackled across battle circuits. Bogies. Bearing 285, range 12 miles, closing fast. 8 VMF 451 Corsairs touched down on Bunker Hill's flight deck as 2 divisions of VF-84 fighters screamed inbound from Combat Air Patrol. They'd just splashed 11 kamikazes from a formation of 30. The math seemed favorable, but mathematics and survival diverged the moment Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori's Mitsubishi Zero broke through the cloud deck at 3,000 feet, followed 30 seconds later by Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa's aircraft. 2 pilots, 2 550-pound bombs, 16 Bofors mounts firing 160 rounds per minute per barrel. The engagement would last 93 seconds and rewrite American understanding of what anti-aircraft fire could and could not accomplish when human will replaced self-preservation. The Japanese High Command had spent 6 months proving something American naval architects refused to believe. Kamikazes were not desperate theatrics. They were guided missiles operated by humans who could not be deterred by defensive fire, who flew through kill zones that would scatter any rational pilot. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Bofors 40mm automatic gun had entered Swedish service in 1936 as an intermediate anti-aircraft weapon, filling the gap between light machine guns and heavy flak cannons. By 1939, 18 nations had purchased production rights. The gun fired a 2-pound high-explosive projectile at 2,600 feet per second. Theoretical cyclic rate, 120 rounds per minute. That theoretical number would prove meaningless once American engineers modified the Swedish design for mass production and naval mounting. When the United States acquired a British test model in December 1940 through a covert shipment aboard a transport that evaded U-boat wolfpacks during a 12-day Atlantic crossing, procurement officers at Dahlgren Naval Proving Ground documented immediate problems. Swedish drawings used metric measurements that matched no American machine tools. Dimension specifications on blueprints contradicted actual weapon measurements. Assembly instructions included phrases like "file to fit at assembly" and "drill to fit at assembly," marginally acceptable for handcrafted peacetime production but catastrophic for wartime mass. Manufacture. One production engineer at Chrysler Corporation, studying the Swedish blueprints in early 1941, reportedly observed that Bofors had designed a gun to eliminate unemployment during the Great Depression. Every component required hand-fitting. Every tolerance demanded skilled machinists. Every gun took 3 times longer to build than American production methodology could accept. The York Lock and Safe Company received the contract to manufacture American Bofors despite possessing 0 experience building weapons. Their expertise in precision machining and their massive industrial capacity mattered more than their ignorance of artillery. Within 6 months, they'd redesigned 147 components, converted all Swedish metric specifications to American standard measurements, and developed power-operated twin and quad mounts that replaced Sweden's manual traverse system. The water-cooled Mark I and Mark II guns that emerged from American factories bore the Bofors name, but represented something fundamentally different. Swedish air-cooled guns fired brief bursts before barrels overheated. American water-cooled naval mounts sustained fire indefinitely. Recoil operation used the gun's own firing impulse to cycle the action, ejecting spent brass and chambering fresh rounds from 4-round clips loaded by a 2-man team per barrel. No gas system, no adjustment screws, just barrel, bolt, spring, and the violent physics of Newton's third law translated into automatic fire. But even perfect mechanical reliability meant nothing without accurate fire control. A bomber crossing at 300 miles per hour traveled 440 feet per second. Human reaction time, mechanical traverse rates, and projectile time of flight created problems that simple eyeball aiming could not solve. Miss by 3 degrees at 2,000 yards, and your shells passed 200 feet from the target. The mathematics demanded a solution that could compute lead angles while the gun rotated, while the ship rolled, while the target jinks and dives and turns. The Mark 51 director system, developed by the Bureau of Ordnance between 1941 and 1943, was that solution. Mounted on pedestals near Bofors quad mounts, each director resembled a small metal box with binocular optics and handlebars. Inside that box lived gyroscopic rate computers that measured target angular velocity in 2 axes. The director-operator tracked the aircraft through crosshair sights. 2 gyroscopes inside the mount measured how fast the director rotated horizontally and vertically as the operator followed his target. Those rotation rates represented target angular velocity, the fundamental input needed to compute firing leads. The mathematics were elegant. Angular rate multiplied by range equaled target linear velocity. Linear velocity multiplied by projectile time of flight equaled required lead distance. Lead distance divided by range produced lead angle. The Mark 51 computed those calculations mechanically, introducing deliberate lag into its gyro outputs that represented where the target would be when 40mm shells completed their flight. Electric signals from the director transmitted bearing and elevation data to follow the pointer dials on the Bofors mounts. Gun crews watched needles on their dial indicators and rotated handwheels to align their own needles with the director signals. When pointers matched, the guns aimed at the predicted intercept point. The system removed smoke, vibration, and chaos from the equation. The director-operator tracked a clean target through stable optics, while gun crews 300 feet away fought through muzzle blast and spent brass, and the screaming of men who understood they were targets for the thing they were trying to kill. Maximum effective range with optical directors measured roughly 1,500 yards. Beyond that distance, optical ranging grew too imprecise for reliable hits, but 1,500 yards translated to 6 seconds of flight time for an aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour. 6 seconds for Bofors crews to identify threat axis, achieve director lock, commence fire, and walk shells into a closing target that grew from speck to vehicle to imminent collision faster than most men could process. The standard defensive response to air attack involved coordinated layers. Combat air patrol fighters engaged at 10 to 20 miles. 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns opened fire at 10,000 yards, with proximity-fused shells that detonated within 70 feet of targets. Bofors 40mm mounts engaged at 3,000 yards and closer. 20mm Oerlikon cannons provided last-ditch defense inside 1,000 yards. Each layer existed to thin incoming raids, forcing attackers through increasingly dense fire as range closed, but kamikaze attacks shattered that defensive model. Conventional bombers released ordnance and turned away when defensive fire grew intense. Self-preservation shaped their tactics. Kamikazes possessed no self-preservation instinct. They flew through defensive fire that would drive off any rational pilot. 5-inch shells that scored near misses, sufficient to damage conventional attackers into aborting, barely registered with pilots committed to controlled collision. The statistics from October 1944 through February 1945 told the story with brutal clarity. Approximately 2,800 kamikaze attackers damaged or sank 402 Allied vessels. Hit rate, 14%. For context, conventional bombing raids against warships managed 3 to 4% hit rates under ideal conditions. Suicide attacks proved 3 to 4 times more accurate than conventional strikes despite defensive fire that should have rendered them impossible. That 14% represented the kamikazes who survived all defensive layers to strike ships. The other 86% died en route, many torn apart by the same Bofors mounts that should have protected American vessels from the 14% who got through. Between October 1, 1944 and February 1, 1945, half of all Japanese aircraft destroyed by U.S. Navy surface vessels fell to Bofors 40mm guns paired with Mark 51 directors, not 5-inch guns with radar fire control and proximity fuses, not fighter aircraft with earlier intercept capability, the intermediate weapon that filled. The gap between light and heavy defenses accounted for 50% of kills because it delivered the highest volume of accurate fire at the ranges where kamikaze commitment became irreversible. Chrysler Corporation manufactured 60,000 Bofors guns and 120,000 barrels between 1942 and 1945. By mid-1944, demand finally matched supply. Every capital ship, every cruiser, every destroyer, every escort carrier in the Pacific Fleet bristled with Bofors mounts. Essex-class carriers like Bunker Hill typically mounted 72 barrels in twin and quad configurations. Iowa-class battleships mounted 80. Even PT boats shipped with at least one 40mm mount. The Navy established a practice of telegraphing Chrysler with serial numbers of guns credited with aircraft kills. By war's end, those telegrams documented thousands of aerial victories. But statistics and telegrams captured nothing of what it meant to stand at a Bofors mount when the thing you were shooting at refused to turn away. Fire controlman James Gallagher had joined Bunker Hill's crew in January 1945 after the carrier completed refit at Bremerton Naval Shipyard. His Mark 51 director station controlled quad mount number 7, positioned on the port quarter of the flight deck. The mount's crew consisted of a captain, pointer, trainer, 2 first loaders and 2 second loaders, plus ammunition passers who formed human chains from magazine to mount. Gallagher and his talker, who relayed target information from Combat Information Center, operated independently, scanning sectors assigned by the Air Defense Officer. Standard engagement doctrine called for directors to lock onto threats at maximum optical range, typically 2,500 to 3,000 yards for aircraft-sized targets in good visibility. Gun crews would align their pointers while the director-operator refined his track. First shells left, barrels at approximately 2,000 yards. Experienced crews could maintain track and sustain fire down to 500 yards if necessary, though most aircraft that penetrated that close either crashed into the sea from battle damage or struck the ship. Gallagher had participated in dozens of defensive actions during Bunker Hill's 58-day combat deployment. Conventional Japanese bombers and torpedo planes, the kind that broke off when fire grew intense. The kind that wanted to live even if their tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive attack. Those engagements followed predictable patterns. Lock at 2,500 yards. Open fire at 2,000. Watch the target waver, turn, or explode by 1,200 yards. The few that pressed through 1,500 yards almost always showed battle damage, smoke trails, or erratic flight, indicating mechanical failure rather than tactical choice. Kamikazes eliminated predictable patterns. They flew straight. They accelerated when hit. They adjusted course not to evade but to ensure impact. The fire control solution became simpler in one sense. No complex deflection angles to compute, but infinitely more terrible because simplicity meant the director-operator watched his target close, regardless of how many shells struck home. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58 from his flag quarters aboard Bunker Hill, understood the mathematics of attrition. His carriers had launched thousands of sorties, suppressed Japanese airfields across Kyushu and Okinawa, destroyed aircraft on the ground and in the air with industrial efficiency. But the Japanese required only small numbers of suicide attackers to threaten catastrophic damage. 10 kamikazes breaking through defensive layers could cripple a carrier task group. 5 could sink a battleship if targeting proved accurate. The solution involved expanding defensive depth. Picket destroyers stationed 50 to 80 miles from carrier groups provided early. radar warning and intercepted kamikazes at maximum range from high-value assets. Combat air patrol strength increased from 8 aircraft to 20 or 30 fighters constantly aloft. Radar-equipped night fighters maintained continuous coverage after sunset. Fighter direction officers coordinated intercepts with improved communication protocols and radar integration, but those measures only reduced the number of kamikazes reaching gun range. They couldn't eliminate the threat entirely. Some would always get through. When they did, survival depended on anti-aircraft guns doing what they were designed to do: destroy aircraft before impact. The institutional assumption, documented in Navy ordnance publications and tactical doctrines from 1942 through 1944, held that sufficient volume of fire would deter or destroy any attacker. Pour enough 40mm shells into the approach path and physics would prevail. But that assumption relied on attackers possessing survival instinct, the rational calculation that death without achieving the objective served no purpose. Kamikazes eliminated rational calculation. They were the objective. Their death was the delivery mechanism. Deterrence became irrelevant. Only destruction mattered, and destruction required either catastrophic structural failure of the airframe or immediate pilot incapacitation. Wounded pilots still flew, damaged aircraft still functioned, engines trailing flame still generated thrust. The threshold for stopping a kamikaze exceeded the threshold for stopping conventional attackers by orders of magnitude. Gunnery officers across the Pacific Fleet documented this reality in after-action reports throughout late 1944 and early 1945. Aircraft absorbed 20, 30, 40 hits from 40mm fire and continued their dives. Targets visibly burning, shedding parts, streaming fuel, pressed attacks to completion. The only reliable defense involved catastrophic kills that destroyed flight control surfaces, shattered engines, or severed wings. Anything less than complete structural disintegration might not stop the attack. That realization transformed how crews engaged kamikazes. Standard doctrine emphasized fire distribution across multiple targets to maximize overall kill probability. Kamikaze defense demanded concentrated fire on single targets until complete destruction occurred, even if that concentration allowed other attackers to close without defensive fire. Better to guarantee destruction of one target than wound 3 and stop none. The morning of May 11th demonstrated exactly why that doctrine evolved. At 10:05 on the morning of May 11th, 1945, Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori's Zero emerged from cloud cover at an altitude of 3,000 feet. His wingman, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa, followed in formation, both aircraft carrying 550-pound bombs mounted beneath their fuselages. They'd departed from airfields on Kyushu 90 minutes earlier as part of Kikusui No. 6, the 6th massed kamikaze operation targeting American carriers supporting the Okinawa invasion. Yasunori, 23 years old and a graduate of Eita-jima Naval Academy, had volunteered for the Special Attack Corps after watching conventional tactics achieve nothing against American air superiority. Ogawa, drafted from Waseda University the previous summer, had accumulated fewer than 150 total flying hours. His flight training, compressed from the multi-year programs that produced Japan's pre-war naval aviators into a 6-month emergency curriculum, provided barely enough skill to keep formation and locate targets. Neither pilot possessed the training or experience to survive combat against American fighters. Their mission design acknowledged that reality and worked around it. Fly low. Use clouds for concealment. Approach from sectors where defensive fire was masked by the carrier's superstructure. Accept that cap fighters would kill most attackers. The few who reached their targets would die, achieving what conventional bombing could no longer accomplish. Before them, USS Bunker Hill presented a target 1,400 feet long and displacing 27,000 tons. Her flight deck crawled with activity as VMF 451 Corsairs landed from dawn patrol and VF-84 divisions approached for recovery. 34 aircraft preparing to land or already on deck, many loaded with fuel and ammunition. A single bomb penetrating that crowded flight deck would ignite fires that ammunition and aviation gasoline would feed into infernos. Yasunori opened fire with his 7.7mm machine guns, strafing Bunker Hill's deck to suppress defensive fire and draw attention. The tactical doctrine made sense in theory. In practice, it simply gave Bofors crews precise targeting information. James Gallagher's director locked onto the Zero at approximately 2,400 yards, his crosshairs centered on the approaching fighter. Gyroscopes inside the Mark 51 measured angular rates as he tracked the target. Electric signals flowed to quad mount number 7. Pointers aligned. 7 men moved in coordinated response to those moving needles. The first 4-round clip fed into barrel number 1. The pointer pressed his firing pedal. The gun recoiled. The barrel moved rearward 3 inches, driving the bolt open, ejecting spent brass, and allowing the automatic loader to strip a fresh round from the clip. Return spring drove barrel and bolt forward. The breech block rose into battery position. The firing pin dropped. The cycle repeated 160 times per minute. Quad mount number 7 put 640 rounds per minute into the sky. When Yasunori crossed through 1,500 yards, 4 more quad mounts joined the engagement. 32 barrels, 5,120 rounds per minute. The sky between Bunker Hill and the approaching Zero filled with tracer fire that marked every 5th round, creating visible streams of metal that appeared solid from a distance. Yasunori flew directly into that fire. His Zero absorbed hits to the wings, fuselage, and engine cowling. Pieces of aluminum skin tore away. The aircraft shuddered under impact but maintained flight. Range closed to 1,000 yards, then 800, then 600. At 10:05 and 30 seconds, Yasunori released his 550-pound bomb above Bunker Hill's flight deck. The bomb penetrated the wooden planking near the base of the island superstructure, travelled through the gallery deck, and exited the starboard side of the hull before detonating in the water. Shrapnel from the explosion killed 3 men on a gun mount facing that side. The Zero, its bomb released and its mission technically accomplished, banked right and crashed into the sea. The engagement had lasted 42 seconds from first director lock to impact. Bofors mounts had pumped thousands of rounds into an aircraft that completed its attack despite absorbing catastrophic damage. Every tactical assumption about defensive fire-stopping attackers had failed because the attacker refused to be stopped. 30 seconds later, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa's Zero reached attack position. Gallagher's director had already shifted to the second target the moment Yasunori's aircraft cleared his sector. Lock at 2,600 yards. The same drill, crosshairs centered, gyros measuring angular rate. Signals flowing to guns, pointers aligning. Loaders feeding clips, barrels firing, recoiling, ejecting, reloading, firing again. But Ogawa approached from a different vector, one that masked him from several Bofors mounts that had engaged Yasunori. Fewer guns tracked him during the critical opening phase. By the time additional mounts acquired him, range had closed to 1,200 yards. His Zero, smaller and more maneuverable than the bomb-laden fighters American gunners had grown accustomed to engaging, presented a more difficult target. The aircraft absorbed hits. Tracers marked impact points across wings and fuselage, but Ogawa maintained course, diving toward Bunker Hill's flight deck at a 30-degree angle that maximized his velocity while keeping his aircraft within control limits. His 550-pound bomb remained attached. His engine continued running. His control surfaces responded. At 600 yards, with every Bofors mount that could bear on target firing at maximum rate, Ogawa's aircraft showed visible damage. Smoke trailed from the engine. Pieces of wing structure had torn away. The aircraft wallowed in flight, responding sluggishly to control inputs. Any conventional pilot would have aborted. Ogawa held course. 400 yards. Bofors shells walked through the Zero's flight path. Several struck home. The aircraft staggered but didn't break. 200 yards. The mathematical convergence of trajectory and defensive fire approached its conclusion. Either the Zero would disintegrate under sustained hits, or it would reach the ship, The threshold between those outcomes measured in fractions of seconds. At 10:06, Ensign Kiyoshi Ogawa's Zero struck USS Bunker Hill's flight deck 30 feet from the base of the island superstructure. The 550-pound bomb detonated on impact. The explosion penetrated to the hangar deck, where 34 aircraft sat fueled and armed. Aviation gasoline ignited instantly. Ammunition began cooking off. Fires spread through ventilation systems into berthing compartments and ready rooms. 3 officers and 11 enlisted men from Admiral Mitcher's staff died in the initial explosion. The blast wave passed through the flag office, killing everyone inside. Mitcher himself, standing on the flag bridge 40 feet from impact, survived because steel plating absorbed shrapnel that would have killed him. On the flight deck, 30 aircraft erupted into flames. Pilots trapped in cockpits burned alive. Deck crews caught in the open were incinerated by flash fires that consumed aviation gasoline spreading across wood planking. Men jumped from the flight deck into the sea to escape flames. Others fought fires with inadequate equipment, their courage exceeding their tools. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Below decks, fires spread through passageways filled with smoke. Sailors trapped in compartments by jammed hatches died from smoke inhalation before flames reached them. Damage control teams struggled through darkness and heat, fighting fires that fed on ammunition and fuel. Engineers maintained steam pressure and electrical power, working in spaces where temperatures exceeded human tolerance. The carrier's fire suppression systems, designed for conventional battle damage, proved insufficient against fires this intense. Foam systems depleted their charges within minutes. Hose teams fought with seawater, but water pressure dropped as pumps failed or piping ruptured. Men formed bucket brigades, passing water hand to hand, their efforts insignificant against conflagrations that consumed entire compartments. By 10:30, fires raged through 5 decks. Casualties exceeded 400. The carrier's ability to conduct flight operations had ceased to exist. Her ability to defend herself had degraded severely, as many Bofors mounts faced sectors where fires prevented crews from manning their stations. Admiral Mitcher, his staff reduced to those who'd been absent from the flag office during the attack, transferred his flag to destroyer English by Britches Boy. From English, he moved to Carrier Enterprise, which became the new Task Force 58 flagship. Bunker Hill, one of the most powerful warships in the Pacific Fleet, had been knocked out of the war by 2 aircraft weighing 3 tons each. The butcher's bill tallied over the following hours as damage control teams regained access to sealed compartments. 396 dead, 43 missing, their remains vaporized in explosions or incinerated beyond identification. 264 wounded. Total casualties, 703. Approximately 1/4 of the ship's complement killed or wounded in 6 minutes. The statistical analysis that would follow in subsequent months documented what happened with mathematical precision. Bunker Hill's Bofors mounts had fired approximately 12,000 rounds during the 2 kamikaze attacks. Hit probability at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards measured approximately 8%. At ranges below 1,000 yards, hit probability increased to 22%. Both aircraft absorbed multiple hits. Neither aircraft stopped before completing its attack. The conclusion was inescapable. 40mm Bofors guns, firing 160 rounds per minute per barrel under Mark 51 director control, represented the most effective close-range anti-aircraft system in the American arsenal. They were also insufficient to guarantee defense against kamikaze attack. Insufficient not because of mechanical failure or crew error, but because the fundamental assumption underlying anti-aircraft defense, that sufficient damage would cause attackers to abort, did not apply when attackers had eliminated self-preservation from their tactical calculus. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The immediate aftermath aboard Bunker Hill focused on survival rather than analysis. Damage control parties fought fires until 1700 hours, 7 hours after the initial attack. Bodies recovered from sealed compartments were brought to the hangar deck and laid in rows for identification. Those whose remains permitted identification received burial at sea ceremonies that lasted through the afternoon of May 12. 143 bodies, too badly burned for visual identification, were buried together in a mass ceremony. Bunker Hill steamed to Ulithi under her own power, maintaining 20 knots despite damage that had gutted significant portions of her interior. From Ulithi, she proceeded to Pearl Harbor and then to Bremerton Naval Shipyard for repairs. The carrier remained in the shipyard when hostilities ended in August 1945. She never returned to combat operations. The tactical lessons learned from Bunker Hill's destruction spread through the Pacific Fleet within days. Anti-aircraft doctrine underwent immediate revision. Engagement priorities shifted from distributed fire across multiple targets to concentrated fire, ensuring complete destruction of individual targets. Bofors crews received instructions to maintain fire on kamikazes until the aircraft disintegrated or struck the ship. Wounding the target was insufficient. Only kills counted. Fire control officers increased emphasis on early target acquisition. The longer Bofors mounts engaged incoming kamikazes, the greater the accumulated damage and the higher the probability of catastrophic structural failure before impact. Engagements beginning at maximum range, even if hit probability remained low during opening phases, allowed more total rounds on target before the attacker closed to lethal range. But the fundamental problem remained unsolved. Kamikazes possessed inherent advantages that no defensive system could completely negate. They approached from multiple vectors simultaneously, saturating defensive fire. They used weather and terrain to mask their approach until terminal phase. They timed attacks to coincide with vulnerable moments, carrier flight operations when aircraft crowded decks or combat air patrol fighters required fuel and ammunition. The Navy's response involved layered improvements across all defensive systems. Combat air patrol strength increased again, maintaining 30 to 40 fighters constantly airborne during daylight hours. Radar picket destroyers pushed further from protected formations, extending early warning ranges. 5-inch guns received improved proximity fuses with more reliable detonation patterns. 20mm Oerlikon mounts, found insufficient against kamikazes, began replacement with additional Bofors 40mm guns. And the Bofors mounts themselves underwent continuous refinement. Water cooling systems received redundant pumps to maintain fire rates during extended engagements. Ammunition supply chains shortened to reduce reload times. Crews trained specifically on kamikaze engagement profiles, learning to maintain track on targets that other anti-aircraft training had taught them would abort. The statistics from the Battle of Okinawa told the story with brutal clarity. From April 1st through June 21st, 1945, approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties struck American naval forces. Those attacks sank 36 ships and damaged 368 others. Casualties exceeded 9,000 killed and wounded. The kamikazes damaged more American warships in 3 months than Japanese conventional forces had damaged in 3 years of Pacific combat. But the same statistics revealed the effectiveness of American defensive measures. Of 1,900 attacking aircraft, approximately 1,600 failed to reach their targets, 84% kill rate. Combat air patrol fighters accounted for approximately 40% of kills. Anti-aircraft fire accounted for 60%. And within that 60%, Bofors 40mm guns claimed the majority of victories because they delivered concentrated fire at the ranges where kamikaze commitment became final. Part 2 of the script. The engineering analysis conducted after Okinawa examined why Bofors guns succeeded where larger weapons failed. 5-inch 38 caliber guns fired proximity-fused shells that should have provided superior kill probability. Each proximity shell detonated within 70 feet of its target, creating fragments that should have shredded aircraft. But 5-inch guns fired slowly, 12 to 15 rounds per minute, and required radar fire control that kamikazes could saturate by approaching in groups. 20mm Oerlikon cannons fired rapidly, 450 rounds per minute, but their projectiles lacked the mass and explosive content to reliably destroy aircraft. Oerlikon fire wounded attackers but rarely stopped them. The guns served better as psychological deterrents against conventional attackers who might break off when under fire than as reliable defensive weapons against kamikazes who would not break off regardless of damage. 40mm Bofors occupied the Goldilocks position between these extremes. Their 2-pound projectiles carried sufficient explosive content to cause catastrophic damage when striking vital aircraft structures. Their rate of fire, 160 rounds per minute per barrel, allowed sustained engagement throughout an attacker's approach. Their maximum effective range of 1,500 yards provided sufficient engagement time for multiple hits before impact. But the critical advantage came from the Mark 51 director system. The gyroscopic rate computers inside each director calculated lead angles automatically, compensating for target motion, ship motion, and projectile ballistics in real time. Gun crews followed pointer indicators rather than attempting to compute deflection angles manually. The system removed human calculation from the equation, allowing crews to focus on target tracking and sustained fire. The combination of mechanical reliability and fire control accuracy created the most effective anti-aircraft system available to the U.S. Navy in 1945. It was still insufficient to prevent catastrophic losses, but it reduced those losses from unacceptable to merely terrible, and in the mathematics of naval warfare, that distinction meant survival for thousands of sailors who would have died aboard ships sunk by kamikazes that Bofors mounts destroyed instead. The Japanese understood this reality through their own statistical analysis. Kamikaze pilots who survived aborted missions due to mechanical failures or weather reported that American anti-aircraft fire had intensified dramatically between October 1944 and May 1945. The curtain of fire from 40mm guns had grown so dense that pilots described flying through it as similar to flying through thunderstorms, an environment where survival felt random rather than skill-dependent. Japanese tactical doctrine evolved in response. Kamikazes began approaching at higher speeds, trading fuel economy for velocity that reduced exposure time to defensive fire. They exploited weather more aggressively, using cloud cover and rain squalls to mask their approach until terminal phase. They coordinated attacks to saturate defensive sectors, forcing American ships to choose which threats to engage rather than engaging all threats. But these adaptations only marginally improved kamikaze effectiveness. The fundamental exchange ratio, aircraft destroyed per ship damaged, remained heavily favorable to American defense. Japan was losing pilots and aircraft faster than replacement training and production could compensate. The strategy that had seemed sustainable in October 1944 appeared unsustainable by June 1945, when pilot quality degraded to levels where many kamikazes crashed into the sea from navigation errors, rather than defensive fire. The broader strategic context reveals why Bofors' effectiveness mattered beyond individual engagements. American invasion plans for the Japanese home islands assumed kamikaze attacks would intensify as defense perimeters contracted. Intelligence estimates projected 5,000 to 7,000 kamikaze sorties during the first 30 days of an invasion. If defensive systems couldn't maintain high kill rates against such numbers, invasion forces would suffer unacceptable losses before securing beachheads. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 eliminated the need for invasion. But the planning documents from that period reveal the extent to which American strategists relied on Bofors guns to make invasion feasible. Every invasion vessel, every transport, every logistics ship destined for Japanese waters carried maximum possible 40mm armament. The guns that had proven themselves at Okinawa would need to prove themselves again on a scale that dwarfed all previous operations. Fire controlman James Gallagher survived the attack on Bunker Hill. He'd been manning his director station on the port quarter when Yasunori's Zero approached from starboard. His mount engaged the second aircraft, Ogawa's Zero, during its final approach. He watched through his director optics as shells struck the target. He watched the target absorb those hits and continue its dive. He watched the impact and the explosion that followed. In interviews conducted decades later, Gallagher described the psychological impact of engaging kamikazes versus conventional attackers. Against conventional aircraft, you could see the moment your fire became effective. The target would waver, turn away, or trail smoke indicating significant damage. That feedback confirmed the defensive system was working. Against kamikazes, that feedback disappeared. Hits registered visually but produced no change in the target's behavior. The aircraft kept coming regardless of damage until it either disintegrated or struck the ship. That psychological reality affected Bofors crews throughout the fleet. They understood, intellectually, that their fire was destroying most attackers before impact. The statistics proved it. But the visceral experience of watching some kamikazes fly through defensive fire and strike home created doubt that statistics couldn't fully address. Every man who survived a kamikaze attack carried the knowledge that luck rather than skill had determined survival. The next attack might penetrate regardless of how well gun crews performed. The institutional response to this psychological burden involved several measures. Rotation schedules for gun crews shortened to prevent exhaustion that degraded performance. Debriefings after each defensive engagement emphasized successful kills rather than dwelling on aircraft that penetrated defenses. Combat pay increased to acknowledge the sustained stress of anti-aircraft defense against an enemy who could not be deterred. But the most effective measure was simply victory. As the war progressed toward its conclusion, as kamikaze effectiveness declined under attrition, as American forces moved closer to Japan, morale improved because crews could see the end approaching. The kamikazes that had seemed like an unlimited threat in October 1944 appeared finite by July 1945, when Japanese airfields ran short of fuel and pilots. The technical evolution of Bofors systems continued through war's end. Late war modifications included the Mark 57 Director, which added radar ranging to optical tracking. The radar component provided accurate range data that optical directors estimated based on target size and clarity. Accurate ranging improved lead angle calculations, particularly during conditions of poor visibility when optical ranging degraded. The Mark 57 entered service in small numbers during the final months of combat. Approximately 1 Mark 57 installed for every 4 Mark 51 directors on capital ships. The system demonstrated improved hit probability, but insufficient combat data accumulated before war's end to fully validate performance claims. More ambitious modifications remained under development when hostilities ceased. The 3-inch 50 caliber gun, firing proximity-fused shells at higher rate than 5-inch guns, was intended to replace Bofors in the anti-aircraft role. The larger projectile's proximity fuse, which couldn't fit inside 40mm shells, promised significantly improved kill probability per round. But the 3-inch 50 program faced delays in fire control system development and never achieved full operational deployment during World War II. The Bofors 40mm gun, designed as a temporary intermediate solution until better systems could be developed, remained the primary close-range anti-aircraft weapon of the US Navy for another decade. Korean War combat validated its continued effectiveness against slower jet aircraft. Vietnam-era operations saw Bofors guns mounted on riverine patrol vessels. The last active-duty Bofors didn't leave US Navy service until the 1970s, when missile systems and rapid-fire cannons finally provided clearly superior performance. That longevity reflected the fundamental soundness of the original Swedish design and the effectiveness of American modifications. A weapon system adopted almost by accident in December 1940 through a covert transatlantic shipment became one of the most successful military firearms in history. Between 1942 and 1945, American factories manufactured 60,000 Bofors guns. Those weapons served on ships from PT boats to battleships, destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft, and saved countless lives through reliable performance under conditions their designers never imagined. The human cost of kamikaze warfare extended beyond immediate casualties. Survivors carried psychological scars that manifested decades later. Studies of Bunker Hill survivors conducted in the 1980s revealed elevated rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety disorders, and depression compared to sailors from ships that hadn't experienced kamikaze attacks. The trauma of watching friends incinerated, of fighting fires with inadequate equipment, of recovering bodies from sealed compartments, created wounds that didn't heal completely. The Japanese pilots who flew kamikaze missions faced their own psychological burdens before death eliminated those burdens permanently. Letters recovered from pilots who died in attacks revealed complex motivations. Some expressed genuine devotion to emperor and nation. Some acknowledged fear but expressed determination to fulfill duty. Some questioned the morality of suicide tactics while accepting them as necessary. Some wrote with the fatalism of young men who understood they'd been ordered to die and could not refuse without dishonor. Those letters, translated and analyzed after the war, revealed the human reality behind the tactical statistics. Each kamikaze represented a person who'd made choices or had choices made for them. Each successful attack meant not only American casualties, but the permanent loss of a trained pilot who might have contributed to Japan's defense, had conventional tactics remained viable. The strategic futility of kamikaze warfare became apparent only in retrospect. In October 1944, when the program began, suicide attacks appeared to offer Japan's best chance to inflict unacceptable casualties on American forces and force negotiated peace. By June 1945, it was clear that kamikaze attacks couldn't prevent American victory. They could only increase the cost of that victory, purchasing time measured in weeks rather than months. The decision to employ atomic weapons rather than invade Japan eliminated the planned expansion of kamikaze operations. Intelligence estimates suggested Japan possessed 9,000 aircraft reserved for suicide missions during an invasion. Whether defensive measures could have maintained high kill rates against such numbers remains unknowable. What is certain is that American planners considered Bofors 40mm guns essential to any invasion plan. The weapons that had proven themselves at Okinawa would form the first line of defense against the largest kamikaze offensive ever attempted. The technological legacy of Bofors' development influenced post-war weapons design. The principles of recoil operation, automatic loading, and direct-to-fire control shaped anti-aircraft gun development for decades. Modern naval close-in weapon systems like the Phalanx CIWS trace conceptual lineage to Bofors, though they use radar fire control and vastly higher rates of fire. The Mark 51 Director's gyroscopic rate computers represented mechanical computing technology at its apex. Electronic computers replaced gyroscopic mechanisms in post-war systems, providing faster calculation speeds and greater accuracy. But the fundamental mathematics remained unchanged. Target angular rate multiplied by range equals linear velocity. Linear velocity multiplied by time of flight equals lead distance. Those equations, computed by spinning gyros in 1945, are computed by digital processors today. The institutional memory of kamikaze warfare shaped American naval doctrine for decades. The Korean War, Vietnam War, and Cold War all featured anti-aircraft defense planning that assumed enemies might adopt kamikaze-like tactics. Missile technology eventually provided capabilities that made manned suicide attacks less attractive than precision-guided weapons. But the psychological shadow of the kamikaze remained in military planning. The Essex-class carrier USS Franklin, damaged by conventional bombing in March 1945, suffered 807 killed, the highest casualty count of any American warship that survived World War II. Bunker Hill's casualties, 396, killed and 264 wounded, represented the second highest toll. Both ships demonstrated that even the most powerful warships could be knocked out of action by relatively small numbers of determined attackers exploiting vulnerabilities in defensive systems. The lessons learned from those attacks informed Cold War carrier design. Armored flight decks, improved compartmentalization, enhanced fire suppression systems, and redundant damage control capabilities all traced back to analysis of kamikaze damage. The carriers that fought in Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War incorporated modifications, driven by understanding what happened to Bunker Hill and Franklin. The Bofors guns that defended those later carriers fired the same ammunition and operated on the same mechanical principles as the guns that fought at Okinawa. Upgrades focused on fire control rather than the basic weapon system. Radar directors replaced optical directors. Computer fire control replaced mechanical calculators. But the fundamental weapon, a 40mm automatic cannon firing 2-pound projectiles at 160 rounds per minute per barrel, remained effective decades after entering service. That effectiveness reflected careful initial design and intelligent modification for mass production. The Swedish engineers who created the original Bofors in the 1930s built a weapon that balanced multiple competing requirements: sufficient projectile weight to damage aircraft, high enough rate of fire to enable multiple hits, manageable recoil to permit accurate sustained fire, mechanical simplicity to ensure reliability. American engineers who adapted that design for naval use added water cooling for sustained fire, power traverse for faster target tracking, and direct-to-fire control for improved accuracy. Those modifications transformed a good land-based anti-aircraft gun into an outstanding naval weapon system without compromising the core design's reliability. Manufacturing challenge of producing 60,000 guns between 1942 and 1945 required industrial mobilization unprecedented in firearms production. Chrysler Corporation alone manufactured more Bofors guns than all Swedish production, from 1932 to 1945 combined. That production volume relied on converting metric specifications to standard measurements, redesigning components for machine production rather than hand-fitting, and training workers with no weapons manufacturing experience to produce guns meeting Navy specifications. The fact that those mass-produced guns achieved reliability rates comparable to hand-fitted Swedish originals testified to the skill of American production engineers and the quality of American industrial capacity. Wartime production emphasized speed and volume over perfection, yet Bofors' reliability remained high throughout the war. Stoppage rates measured less than 1% during sustained fire, better than most military firearms achieve under ideal conditions. That reliability mattered most during moments like the attack on Bunker Hill, when mechanical failure meant death. Bofors mounts that engaged Kamikazes fired continuously for minutes at maximum rate. Ammunition consumption exceeded design specifications. Heat loading exceeded safe limits. Yet the guns continued cycling, continued firing, continued providing the only defense available against attacks that couldn't be deterred. James Gallagher's director station on Bunker Hill had controlled one of 16 mounts that engaged the attacking Kamikazes. His mount fired approximately 800 rounds during the engagement. His guns didn't stop either attack, but across Task Force 58 that morning, other Bofors mounts engaged other Kamikazes. Most of those engagements ended with the attacker destroyed before reaching its target. The statistical aggregate of many engagements produced survival for most ships, even though individual engagements sometimes failed. Understanding that statistical reality required accepting that no defensive system guaranteed success. The best anti-aircraft gun in the world, manned by the most skilled crew, using the most advanced fire control, would still fail occasionally because probability permitted failure. The goal was reducing failure rate to the minimum achievable level. Bofors guns with Mark 51 directors achieved that goal better than competing systems. The Japanese never developed an effective counter to Bofors defenses. They attempted various tactical modifications, approaching at different altitudes, using cloud cover, coordinating attacks to saturate defenses, employing decoys to draw fire. None of these modifications significantly reduced Bofors' effectiveness. The fundamental problem remained that aircraft flying predictable terminal approach paths gave directors clean tracking solutions and guns clear fields of fire. The only partially successful Japanese counter involved the Oka rocket-powered piloted bomb, nicknamed Bakar, meaning fool, by American forces. The Oka, released from a bomber several miles from target, accelerated to speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour during terminal approach. At such speeds, tracking with optical directors became extremely difficult and time available for engagement compressed to seconds. But Oka attacks occurred rarely because the launching aircraft carrying the Oka were large, slow, and vulnerable to fighter interception. Most Oka missions ended with the launching aircraft shot down before releasing its payload. The few Oka that reached launch position achieved mixed results. Some struck targets successfully, others missed due to the difficulty of controlling a rocket-powered aircraft at extreme speeds. Standard kamikaze attacks using conventional aircraft, despite their lower success rate, proved more practical because they required only single-engine fighters available in large numbers. The simplicity of kamikazes, ordinary aircraft flown by ordinary pilots in extraordinary ways, made them impossible to completely counter. No technological solution could eliminate a threat that required only determination and basic flying skills. The war ended before Japan exhausted its kamikaze capabilities. Fuel shortages limited sorties during the final months of combat. Pilot training degraded as experienced instructors died in combat operations. Aircraft production struggled to replace losses, but substantial numbers of aircraft and pilots remained in reserve for defense of the home islands. Whether that reserve would have proven as effective as earlier kamikaze operations remains unknowable. What is certain is that American forces preparing for invasion planned on the assumption that kamikaze attacks would intensify. The Bofors guns that had defended the fleet at Okinawa would need to defend invasion beaches against attacks launched from nearby airfields. The defensive challenge would have exceeded anything previously experienced because kamikazes operating from Japanese homeland bases would enjoy minimal flight time to target and maximum tactical flexibility. The atomic bombs eliminated that scenario. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the threat of kamikaze attack ended permanently. The psychological relief aboard American warships in the Pacific was immediate and profound. Crews who'd spent months under constant threat of suicide attack could finally stand down. They'd survived. USS Bunker Hill, still undergoing repairs at Bremerton Naval Shipyard, never returned to combat. The carrier joined the post-war reserve fleet and was eventually scrapped in the 1970s after decades in mothballs. Her combat record included 11 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation, covering 18 months of operations from November 1943 to May 1945. She'd fought in the Solomon Islands, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, before two kamikazes knocked her out of the war. The Bofors guns that defended her remain scattered across museums and memorial sites. One of Bunker Hill's quad mounts resides at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, preserved as artifact of the most effective anti-aircraft system of World War II. Visitors can examine the mechanisms, the recoil-operated barrels, the automatic loading system, the director mounting brackets. What they can't see is the memory of those mechanisms in action, firing at targets that wouldn't turn away, defended by crews who understood the mathematics of their survival, depended on machinery functioning flawlessly under conditions that exceeded any peaceful test. Fire Controlman James Gallagher returned to civilian life in Chicago after the war. He worked in manufacturing for 37 years, rarely discussing his Navy service. In interviews conducted during the 1980s as part of oral history projects, he described May 11, 1945, with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting ordinary events. He watched the kamikazes approach. He tracked them with his director. His guns fired. The aircraft struck the ship. People died. These were facts, neither more nor less significant than any other facts, but pressed for detail, he acknowledged the psychological weight. Every time he manned his director station after May 11th, he understood clearly that skill and equipment might not be sufficient. The guns might function perfectly, the director might track flawlessly, the crew might perform without error, and still the target might reach the ship because suicide attacks eliminated defensive assumptions that conventional attacks validated. That knowledge never left him. 40 years after the war, he could still describe with perfect clarity the view through his director optics as Ogawa's Zero, absorbed hits and continued its dive. The aircraft should have disintegrated. Physics and engineering and common sense, All said the accumulated damage would cause structural failure, but the aircraft held together long enough to complete its attack, and that fact proved that should have meant nothing against enemies who rejected every assumption that defensive systems relied upon. The broader lesson extended beyond anti-aircraft defense to encompass asymmetric warfare generally. Kamikazes represented enemies willing to accept certain death to achieve uncertain results. No conventional defensive measure could completely counter that willingness, because conventional measures assumed opponents valued survival. When that assumption failed, defensive effectiveness degraded regardless of technological sophistication. The Bofors 40mm gun, firing 160 rounds per minute per barrel under Mark 51 director control, represented the best conventional response available. It worked more effectively than any competing system. It saved thousands of lives by destroying most attackers before impact. It proved reliable under conditions that would have disabled less robust designs, but it couldn't guarantee protection against enemies who would die to complete their mission. The Japanese had discovered something the world would rediscover repeatedly in subsequent decades. Determined individuals willing to die can inflict disproportionate casualties on vastly superior forces. The equation becomes not whether defenses can stop all attacks, because they cannot, but whether defenses can stop sufficient attacks to make the tactic unsustainable. Against kamikazes, American defenses achieved that threshold. The kill rate exceeded 80%. That level of attrition made kamikaze warfare unsustainable for Japan. But the casualties inflicted by the 20% who got through remained devastating for individual ships and crews. Bunker Hill's 700. 3 casualties represented the price of being in the 20%. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.